Bonjour and welcome to Cultural Humility, working in and with tribal communities. Veronica and I are very happy to join today and to talk about this topic. We are very thankful to TYRC asking us to present to you today and to share this time talking about cultural humility. Thank you all for being here today and for your time. Buju ginawa sagmakwe indigo jibwe mong. Nigizi Nidode Mashkizi being Nadunjaba. I just introduced myself by stating my spirit name. My name is Lisa Stark and I am Eagle Clan. I am an enrolled citizen of the River Ojibwe tribe from the northern shores of Lake Superior in northern Wisconsin. I am a training and technical assistant with the National Native Children's Trauma Center based in Missoula, Montana. I am a social worker by trade, and my professional background has been primarily in tribal child welfare. I am a mom of 3, of a college student, and 2 teenagers. I currently reside in Missoula, Montana, and I love living in the mountains. Veronica, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Yad Apene. She'e Veronica Willeto DeCrane Yaneshia, Huan Sana Nishlena Kedena Bashichin, Twitch Ini Dashanella Tratnesani Dashache, Tach Ij Bitwet Nashado Billings, Montana de Kashte, Kut Ego Dena San Shlen. So good morning, all of you. I am Navajo. I grew up in New Mexico on my homelands there, and now I live in Billings, Montana with my husband, and we have 5 children. And let's see, before I came to the trauma center, I was working in schools in Montana and working in education as well as youth development. And so that's my background, and I am now a training and technical assistance manager at the National Native Children's Trauma Center. So thank you so much for having us, and we are looking forward to having discussions today and hope that you will find the information and discussions helpful for yourself and for the work that you do for tribal youth.
Thank you, Veronica. Today we will open with a poem called Being by Tanea Winder. This poem just sets us in a cultural humility mode, as this is coming from a cultural lens of tribal nations. Wake up, greet the sun, and pray. Burn cedar, sweetgrass, sage, sacred herbs to honor the lives we've been given, for we have been gifted these ways since the beginning of time. Remember, when you step into the arena of your life, think about those who stand beside you, next to you, and with you. Your ancestors are always in your corner, along with your people. When we enter this world, we are born hungry. Our spirits long for us to live out our traditions that have been passed down for generations. Prayer, ceremony, dance, language, our ways of being. Never forget you were put on this earth for a reason. Honor your ancestors. Be a good relative. Next slide. So in our field of work, learning is a lifelong journey. We see that this training as one moment along with your journey to continue to learn and support others. By the end of today's training, we hope you will walk away with the ability to describe key aspects of identity development, to recognize how important identity development is, especially for American Indians and Alaska Natives. And we hope you'll recognize why cultural humility is important and that you will assess your own level of cultural humility. That's part of our lifelong learning process. Okay? And we hope you will gain cultural awareness and understanding in working with tribal communities. Next slide. We are going to show you a short video on defining what cultural humility is. In this video, Melanie and Jan will talk about the 3 dimensions of cultural humility. Go ahead and cue.
One word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually.
If I had to encapsulate cultural humility, the whole concepts of cultural humility, it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
Escuchar.
Being. You.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal, yes? Our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
Cultural humility is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Tervalon and I conceptualized 3 dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often tried to call me anything but African American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
An African-American nurse is caring for a middle-aged Latina woman several hours after the patient had undergone surgery. A Latino physician on a consult service approached the bedside and, noting the moaning patient, commented to the nurse that the patient appeared to be in a great deal of post-operative pain. The nurse summarily dismissed his perception, informing him that she took a course in nursing school in cross-cultural medicine and knew that Hispanic patients overexpressed the pain that they're feeling. The Latino physician had a difficult time influencing the perspective of this nurse, who focused on her self-proclaimed cultural expertise.
It was curious to this Latino physician who, first of all, was Latino, not like all, in his case, not like all Mexican Americans know everything there is to know about Mexican American patients. That wasn't it, but he might have been a resource for that African American nurse in that moment that she didn't feel like she needed again because she had bought into this notion of competence, of cultural competence.
The distinction between cultural humility and cultural competence was that we were in a process and a relationship that had many other layers to it, and that we were less comfortable with even the term of competence in a way that I think people understand well, and that it implies, especially for people who are providers and are trained in academia, that you are then all-knowing and all-powerful. And we felt like that was not what was happening for us as we were learning from community and understanding in a very practical way how families were coming to the hospital and feeling as if they really were not being heard from their own heritage and history, and how that impacted what they came to the hospital with that we didn't know anything about, hadn't even a clue about. For us, this is part of the humility piece of it, getting to understand that, not trying to humiliate you, not trying to make you feel bad, trying to help us all understand that life is like this, and to, in a certain sense, be really happy about not knowing.
In April of 1992, in the wake of the Los Angeles riots, following the initial not guilty verdict of the police officers accused of beating Mr. King, the Children's Hospital Oakland community was compelled to meet in a series of highly charged sessions to expose and critique our own patterns of institutional racism, injustice, and inequity. My name is Dr. Melanie Turvalon, and I am Director of Multicultural Affairs here at Children's Hospital Oakland.
I wanted to thank everybody for coming to what is a celebration for me of this year.
Jan and I had the good fortune, really, to be together in the same place when this work was evolving. Jan and I, while we're several years difference in age, are both African American women, and both raised by women who were teachers. And we come out of that, and fathers who were working men, who come out of that Southern tradition and who participated fully in the civil rights movement in the way that meant that they made sacrifices and their children made sacrifices, and they taught us about those sacrifices and raised us each in ways to understand that we were here to serve.
Thank you. Next slide. So what is cultural humility? Cultural humility focuses on the other rather than yourself. It is having respect for others, especially in their way of being. Kind of as Melanie was talking about in a video, it's a way to connect when we don't know and we don't understand. It is having a lack of superiority and approaching with a sense of humility and recognizing that one's own beliefs are not superior to others' values, beliefs, or worldview. Embodying cultural humility means staying open to new information. As we mentioned earlier, learning is a lifelong learning process. Information changes, humans evolve. We adapt. So this means that one is able and willing to hear, you just don't get it. In working with tribal communities, it is also really important to understand and know that although you may know a lot about the culture and history of those that you are supporting, each individual or family may have diversity in who they are and what they need. I'll give you an example. Even though my brother and I, we are from the same tribe, we have the same parents, the same background, how you would come into my home and work with my family would be very different how you work with my brothers. One of my older brothers has a Japanese wife, and they're very enculturated in Japanese culture as well. So adapting to including that, whereas we don't have the Japanese culture in our home, adapting and practicing in a cultural humility, humble way would be different for even, my brother and I who are from the same family. So next slide. Influences shape our racial and ethnic identity through two processes. The first one is socialization, and the second one is acculturation. Socialization is learning to behave in a way that is acceptable to society. This can even change when you move from community to community. I know just how I would act within my own tribal community versus one that's a few hours away that I'm very familiar with. There's just certain nuances that you do or don't do. Acculturation is assimilation to a different culture, and typically the dominant one. The mechanisms of these influences are messages. Messages are subtle or explicit, positive or negative, or protective or harmful. Understanding the impact of these messages and learning how to differentiate between those that support or hinder our racial and ethnic identity is important for each and every one of us. We must also understand the role that we play in conveying messages to others and the impact of those messages on their racial and ethnic identity. We may have an intent of sending out a good message, but the way that that can be taken in or perceived by the person you are giving that message to can be very different than your intent. So it's having that awareness of that as well. Next slide. So this is an opportunity where we're going to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about some of these questions that we have on this slide. And we're going to ask that you annotate on the slide. Antonia or Laura can explain that if you need more direction on that. And we just ask that you participate. We know that some of these questions may be sharing your vulnerability, so we just ask what you are comfortable with doing. But then also to just try and to answer as much as you can. I think the next slide is the annotation.
If you are able to see the annotate button on your control panel, you can click annotate and you should be able to click text or draw. If you're not able to see the annotate button, then please use the chat box.
One other note, there's one other location that option could be. So if you don't see it in the control panel, if you look to the very top of your screen, you may see a button that says View Options with a little downward facing arrow. And if you click that, you may find the annotate button there as well.
So one of the questions, if someone asked you to describe your racial and ethnic identity, what would you tell them? Another question is, what influences have affected your racial and ethnic identity? What has the impact been for you? Or how does your race and ethnicity influence your sense of identity? And what do you wish others knew about your racial and ethnic identity? I did put the questions in the chat box too, so you can see them. So we're seeing a lot of participants put into chat how they identify themselves. It looks like annotation is not working. So we have quite a diverse group in this webinar, so that's beautiful to see. You see that Renee posted she is an enrolled member of LCO. That's where I worked at before coming to Missoula with National Native Children's Trauma Center. So hi, Renee. So we have a lot of tribal and a lot of, we just have quite diversity here. So someone posted, it affects my sense of self. I hope I'm making me more approachable and accepting of others. I'm trying to scroll through chat here. You guys are posting quite fast. Just trying to screen through some of these. It's also, I see that some have posted that some may not fully know a lot about their racial and ethnic identity, and having cultural humility about that as well. That would probably be another training, but there's a lot of reasons why that would happen, especially with different diverse populations or backgrounds. It could be due to like historical trauma, policies of the past, but just having an understanding that populations or people you work with may not have that knowledge as well. So these are just some questions to think about for yourself, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides. Why it is important of knowing yourself and having a strong sense of yourself in practicing cultural humility as well. Thanks for all your great answers. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you everyone for sharing. So without understanding ourselves and where we are in our own journey with our own racial and ethnic identity development, we may send messages negatively influenced by our own personal biases. Part of that lifelong learning journey is to be self-aware and to constantly check ourselves, especially when we make mistakes, or if we don't know something. It's okay to say, I don't know. Can you explain this to me? But these messages may create barriers for ourselves and those that we work with. This self-exploration looks at how we define our own racial and ethnic identity and how we think others see us. It helps us to answer some important questions. And then understanding ourselves involves both honest exploration and assessing ourselves. With honest exploration, race and ethnicity are sometimes uncomfortable to address. It may not always be comfortable to talk about, or even what is going on politically or with government or with the environment around us. It seems now that it's getting harder to have that honest exploration or having discussions about it. But often we find it easier to look outward at others than it is to look inward and to explore our own lives. Recognizing our levels of comfort and discomfort using honest and open reflection is the only way to move forward in our personal racial and ethnic identity journey and to help others move forward in their journey as well. With assessing yourself, depending on how we fit or don't fit within mainstream society, the challenges we face around racial and ethnic identity can be very different. For some of us, particularly those who fit within mainstream, that would not be me, but the challenges have been less visible and in some cases minimal. But the reality for others is a challenge of having to daily face the burden of being defined and judged by their race and ethnicity. Next slide. So generally speaking, there are 4 stages of racial and ethnic identity development. With relative unawareness, racial and ethnic differences are recognized, but race or ethnicity has low salience and is not considered an important aspect of life. Acceptance of negative stereotypes about people from other races or ethnicities or about people from their own racial or ethnic group, or examination of personal race and ethnicity may not have begun, or greater value may be placed on other aspects of identity, or unconscious identification with whiteness may have preference towards the values and norms that dominates white culture. Under emerging awareness, it's understanding around the social significance of race and ethnicity. Realization that in a society of multiple cultures, people are sometimes treated differently and badly based on their racial or ethnic background. It occurs after an experience or accumulation of experiences that lead to an abandonment of attitudes associated with relative awareness. And reactions at this stage will be varied and may include confusion, anger, guilt, depression, self and group appreciation, and depreciating attitudes and behaviors. Under exploration and identification, people may experience conflict between allegiance to one's own racial and ethnic group and issues of personal autonomy, may be actively engaged in defining for themselves what it means to be a member of their racial or ethnic group based on growing recognition of that race and ethnicity are essential components of our society. It can include negative views of the mainstream in general, and whites specifically, as well as rejection of dominant values and norms. And for youth, it may include exploring positive aspects of one's own racial ethnic group membership, development of ways to function in the mainstream, and development of an independent sense of self. Under commitment, we may see positive feelings about one's ethnic group membership, experiences, confidence, and security about racial identity, and the acceptance of both positive and negative aspects of one's racial and ethnic group. It may include committing to eliminating all forms of oppression, respecting and appreciating other racial and ethnic groups, and the ability to see positive and negative aspects of these groups. It's being open to acquiring new awareness, knowledge, and skills regarding race and ethnicity, as well as skills to combat and cope with racism and discrimination. And it not necessarily the conclusion of development, likelihood that prior stages may be revisited as well. Next slide. Oh, I think we need one more slide over. Oh, nope, that might, nope, sorry. I think my computer is lagging a little, sorry. So everyone's racial and ethnic identity is shaped by the external influences of acculturation and socialization, as well as group membership. This figure shows how an individual's racial and ethnic identity is impacted by these influences and processes. In the outer circle, we see that acculturation is a process of changes that occurs at an individual or group level when two groups come into contact with one another. In the formation of racial and ethnic identity, influences such as government policies, media stereotypes, prevalent societal values and beliefs, and institutional racism influence an individual's sense of self. Just let's think about how government policies, media stereotypes, our society's values and beliefs, and institutional racism have influenced your racial and ethnic identity. That can be part of doing your own self-awareness or doing those checks on yourself as well. In the middle circle, we see that racial and ethnic socialization refers to the influence of significant others that affect the way one behaves, thinks, and feels about the racial and ethnic group membership. The process can be direct and indirect, implicit and explicit. Ultimately, these socializing influences affect the way individuals view themselves and how they interact with others in society. When we're checking on ourselves or doing this on ourselves, we can think about how school, family, peers, community have influenced your racial and ethnic identity. It could even be like neighborhoods, cities. It can be endless of what can influence you in this realm. In the inner circle, this represents a core of racial and ethnic identity formation. The dynamic interplay in developing an individual sense of self that is based on the knowledge and experience of one's racial and ethnic group membership. Think about how your racial and ethnic group memberships have influenced your identity. And for the individual in this realm or within this circle, we see that each of these circles of influence affect an individual's identity, social competence, and psychological well-being. And let's think about when you're assessing how have each of these circles affected your identity, your social competence, and your psychological well-being. Next slide. So messages play a significant role in the process of acculturation and socialization. I mentioned that in the previous slide. In a society where we have diverse population, multiple cultures, we have governmental policies, media stereotypes, prevalent societal values and beliefs, institutional racism, prejudice, discrimination toward people of color, all impact an individual's identity. To counterbalance the impact of these messages, as well as build a realistic awareness of injustice and avoid giving up all hope for the future, we utilize proactive and protective messages. Here are a few examples of proactive messages. So an example is while reading a book about Latinos, and mom turns and tells her child that the hero of the book, this character is smart, just like you. Or another example, are the parents of a Native American girl. They take her to a powwow and talk about the purpose of the powwow. They explain to her what's going on, why things are happening the way they are, even just how like the dancers move in a certain way. And it's to preserve the tradition of the tribe, to renew friendships, and to celebrate in song and dance. But those are active messages we're sending to show, pride and healthiness. Next slide. And with protective messages, we have some examples of, protective messages are those where we remind and prepare our youth to face hostility or racism in the mainstream. I can tell you as an Indigenous mom, I am and a social worker. My kids always talk about my social work talks, which I know they love, but they pretend not to love. But we have these conversations because I need my children to be able to be aware and to be aware of their own safety. So an example, maybe a Native father sits with his 13-year-old and tells him that he wants him to work hard in high school and to make good grades because it should be Natives have to work harder to make it. Or after his son is stopped by the police for hanging out with his friends, the father talks to his son about how to deal with police, because with our Black relatives, the African Americans, cops will shoot first and ask questions later. These are different conversations that we have to have in order to send those protective messages as well. Next slide. So the impact of messages, even though if our intent may be well, as I had talked earlier, it may be taken or perceived or accepted in a very different way. So a lot of times when someone is saying, we are all human, I don't see color, I treat everyone the same, you may be trying to be giving a positive message, but what the impact could be is that maybe the person you're saying it to may feel that race and ethnicity are something to be ashamed of, or they may, if someone says, I'm tired about talking about race. Well, if someone is constantly on a daily basis being judged by their racial and ethnic identity, that is certainly silencing someone and not letting them speak their truth or share with you or to connect as well. So it's a lot of cultural humility is being aware of what we are saying and how it can impact the other person as well, and having that awareness. Next slide. So again, we're going to have these questions, and because of not annotate, go ahead and use the chat box. Go ahead and just leave it on to the slide deck so everyone can see. So in the chat box, go ahead and answer, how have government, media, and society influenced your racial and ethnic identity? Or how did the communities or neighborhoods where you grew up influence the development of your racial and ethnic identity? How has your family influenced the development of your racial and ethnic identity? Or do you feel connected to your racial and ethnic groups? If so, how? If not, why? Give that a few minutes. So someone posted strengthen desire to know more about where they come from and having pride. Others are posting about like institutional or covert racism that is existing. Just going to take a quick drink here. So I just saw someone post that they feel ashamed of being white. Just from my own personal perspective, be proud of who you are. You have ancestors too. They've brought you to where you are. They've gone through their struggles. You have their blood memory as well. Be proud. And that goes for anyone and everyone. Grandmother and aunts were an influence because they spoke Yiddish and Hebrew and connected to the culture. That's awesome. There are some families who don't talk about their history or where they come from or their roots. Media stereotypes, even cartoons, can make children confused. Absolutely. I remember growing up and learning history. I actually grew up we're one of two Native families, and it was mostly white. But just seeing the pictures of Native Americans in my history books where they were scalping or killing people, that had quite an impact on just myself. And I would have to go home and ask my dad about it. And he would have to do those protective messages or sit down and teach me from our perspective. So again, this is just a time to think about yourself and answering these questions for yourself, because it does help you connect and work with other populations. We're just talking specifically about working with tribal nations or communities, but for all diverse populations that you work with, having a good sense of yourself, your awareness or what levels you're at can be quite helpful. Government and media have harmed the perception of others. I've seen where someone has posted that their great grandparents escaped Germany death camp, and that's a form of historical trauma as well that's similar to like Native Americans, and carrying that as well. But thank you for sharing and exploring these questions. As we mentioned earlier, it may not always feel comfortable exploring or answering these questions, but there's a reason and a purpose about doing that. And I think I will turn this over to Veronica.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm just reading all of the answers in chat and just kind of blown away by everyone's willingness to share of themselves and share their story. And each of your stories are so unique and important. And I'm thankful that you're willing to share that in this space. There's some pieces of it that I know we're going to be talking about in this next section. So we're just wrapping up this this discussion around, you know, who we are and our own identity. So we're now going to be talking about how we see others. And that is, as Lisa has been saying, greatly influenced by how we see ourselves and our own identity and where we're at with our own identity development. So next slide. So I want to say a statement, and I hope that you will just kind of reflect on this statement. We each walk in different worlds. So we each walk in different worlds. That's indicated very well in the chat box right now as people are sharing their world with us. So regardless of how each of us understand our own racial and ethnic identity, society does judge people by the color of their skin. And it does judge them by their ethnicity and also by how others perceive their racial and ethnic identity. So sometimes that's out of our hands. So it's not enough to acknowledge and celebrate the differences between us. We must move beyond mere acknowledgement and acceptance and value racial and ethnic differences. And hopefully through that, we can better understand others and have a more positive impact on society. I noticed that one of the individuals who shared in the chat was talking about how they felt like they had different views. They had different values than maybe even members of their own racial or ethnic group. And so really wanting to make a different impact than maybe what they've seen being made. And so that's something that, you know, hopefully with a better understanding of how we see others, that we can have a more positive impact on society by just being that different perspective, being providing a different way to move about within society. So we're all exposed to stereotypes. We mentioned some of them, you know, even just with cartoons, you know, it starts early with our children. So we're all exposed to stereotypes. We all have prejudices and misinformation about people different than us, as well as those that are similar to us or like ourselves. And if we leave these stereotypes unexamined and unchallenged, they can become attitudes and beliefs that lead to discrimination and have harmful effects on individuals and society. And when we discriminate against people based on race, we practice a form of racism known as individual racism. And we'll talk more about this. It's natural to make generalizations about our world. Some researchers suggest we make generalizations as a way to process overwhelming amounts of information. So we make it easier on ourselves by generalizing. But generalizations become problems when we apply them to all members of a group, leading to the loss of an individual's uniqueness and identity. Assumptions form when we take generalizations for granted and accept them as truth without requiring evidence or proof. Assumptions may incorrectly characterize people and negatively influence our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So it's really important for us to question our assumptions. I think about this when we work with youth because oftentimes We may make assumptions about Native youth, maybe from our past experiences. It may be that we've worked with that the family that youth comes from, or maybe an older brother that youth has, or older sibling, or other relatives, and we may make assumptions about that young person based on maybe them being Native, maybe them being from a certain tribe, maybe just them being from a family, a certain family, and how that can be detrimental to that young person. So that's just one example in the work that you do that maybe making assumptions might have a negative impact. Individuals who are not members of mainstream society learn various ways to function in response to daily struggles with stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. It may be that they deal with this through cultural alienation, dualism. We often talk about our Native youth living in two worlds. So feeling like there's this dualism that is happening, separation, feeling separated from others, and negotiation, having to maybe negotiate some of their own values and beliefs in order to fit in with the mainstream society. So these are just 4 examples of response patterns for survival. But how people adapt and cope within an oppressive environment helps us understand their reality and how we can influence change. So we'll talk more about how people adapt and cope as we talk more about the impact of how society and how we see others. Next slide. So there is such a thing as racial trauma. That's one word for it. Sometimes it's referred to as race-based trauma. We're actually having conversations within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, even questioning these terms. And really, we've been starting to have conversations around that race not really being the issue, that it's more white supremacy culture. So trauma experience because of white supremacy culture. So there's different terms and ways in which this is talked about. But racial trauma refers to the cumulative effects of stress, both physical and emotional, due to racism. Racial trauma involves ongoing exposure, re-exposure, and injury on the collective as well as individual levels. It's experienced through unintentional comments, passive-aggressive actions, omission or exclusion due to the color of someone's skin, failure to intervene or offer support during overt racism, or obvious behaviors rooted in racial biases. It also includes discrete events that look like harm or injury, humiliating or shaming, and witnessing harm to others based on race. So that might actually, these more discrete events, to me personally, feel much more hurtful, because you know something's wrong. You know that there's some injury happening, and maybe you're witnessing it or you are the one experiencing it, but it's being done in a discrete way. Racial trauma is also at the institutional and structural levels. So how this is occurring or has occurred is with European settlers who enslaved Africans and enacted genocide on Native American communities is really where this history in this country started from, this racial trauma. So this racial trauma was brought to the United States. As we just learned, the impact of, we'll learn more about the impact of this and on generations, but also collective groups of people. So our society then developed systems based on race, gender, and religion to dictate how our society was ordered, how we were going to assign power, and how resources like jobs, food, and housing were going to be distributed. So whether we want to admit it or not, or whether we are aware of it or not, this has been happening in our country. And you guys might even have some examples of this, maybe even in your own family of stories that are shared with you, or just knowing about the history of our country, some examples of how this has happened. And these initial structures became embedded in laws and practices, which have resulted in a long history of bias, disadvantage, ill treatment, violence, and exclusion toward racial and ethnic minority groups. So for example, for Native people, one of the examples that I can give is blood quantum. So today it's almost commonplace for a lot of tribes to use blood quantum, but it wasn't actually determine membership, a tribal membership. And this isn't something that came from tribes, and that tribes enacted on their own volition. Is actually something that was influenced by the dominant culture and by the federal government to impose these blood quantum regulations in order to determine tribal membership. So that's just one example. So these disadvantages, ill treatment, violence, and exclusion still exist today, and it is evidenced by disproportionality and disparities. One of the things that we know about when it comes to racial trauma is that people of color, BIPOC individuals and communities experience higher levels of trauma and adverse life experiences compared to their white counterparts. And racism and race-based violence are fundamental causes of health and mental health inequities and poorer outcomes for people of color. So how we see this in individuals is at an individual level is that people of color often experience increased risk of PTSD, depression, and substance use due to chronic experiences of stress, threats, and violence that occur in direct relation to race and aspects of their identity. At a collective level, we see this with people of color experiencing economic and educational disadvantages and lack of access to and trust in different types of service systems like healthcare systems. And then at a generational level, at a broader level, even as generation from generation, we are seeing that there's also impacts on psychologically, there's impacts socially on generations. There's also even impacts genetically, so on people's genes that get passed down from one generation to the next. So why does this matter? The effects of racism, past and present, continue to play out today. A critical element of trauma intervention is overcoming taboos, such as naming racism and making the unspeakable speakable. So that's what we're doing today. Racism is uncomfortable to talk about. It's uncomfortable to say. It's uncomfortable to even mention white supremacy culture. But these taboos are actually what continues, what's part of the problem and continues to really cause racial trauma in our country. So an acknowledgement of past experiences of trauma enables opportunities for healing invisible wounds. These are wounds that we may not personally see that others have, but they're there and they experience it and it's very real for them. An awareness of and responsiveness to a person's cultural experience can significantly improve their mental health outcomes. So this is why we're talking about this today. Next slide. So I'm going to start off by talking about the generational impacts and specifically as it pertains to tribal communities around racial trauma. So Lisa already mentioned historical trauma, and that is actually a racial trauma, simply because the reason that it is historical trauma is how it's linked to ethnicidal and genocidal intent. So some people talk about generational trauma and how intergenerational trauma and how perhaps maybe, for example, in a family who may be struggling with substance abuse, that might actually become a cycle in their family to where, maybe that's something that the parents are struggling with. And then as the children become older, they also start to struggle with substance use. And then it's something that kind of continues in their family as a cycle. So that can be true no matter what kind of history that family background that family has. So that can happen with any family. But when it comes to historical trauma, what makes it specifically historical trauma is that ethnocidal and genocidal intent around some historical events that have happened to a collective group of people who share an identity. And so those historical events that were rooted in ethnocide or genocidal and attempts on people's lives, and maybe even successful attempts on people's lives, such as the Holocaust, those actually had some psychological wounds that really affected people over their lifespan, but not just those who initially experienced it, the survivors, but it was also something that got passed down through the generations. And even the descendants of those survivors are struggling with those psychological wounds. And so because of that, it's a massive group trauma. So it's not just a single person or a single family that is dealing with this, it's a whole group of people. And so that's one way in which racial trauma has impacted generations. So we have to remember for tribal peoples that this actually occurred, these historical events that were traumatic, this historical trauma actually occurred over 500 years. So it wasn't just a single historical event, but multiple events that occurred. Next slide, please. So as we think about, some of you might already be aware of some of the historical trauma that tribal peoples have been facing in this country for centuries. But we also, for those of you who are not very familiar, I'm just going to be talking about a few examples of it in general ways, because one of the things that I think as you learn more about the tribal peoples that you are specifically working with, or that you, the tribal youth that you are serving, that there's actually unique histories that you can become aware of and learn more about. But collectively, for Native people, there are some themes, some experiences that we share. And so one of the themes that I like to bring out is removal. So what was sometimes considered the most detrimental around the federal Indian policies that really were behind a lot of the historical trauma that tribal peoples have faced is this idea of removal. And it really began with removal from land. And that's something that's really significant because a lot of tribal peoples, their values, their belief systems, their way of life was really rooted in the land and their relationship to the land, and in the belief that that there was this interconnectedness and interdependence between human beings and the land. And so a lot of what was built around tribal societies, like their economies and just everything about their culture, their languages, all of that was tied to the land. And so this first removal from land was really detrimental to a lot of tribal societies and traumatizing to them. And then other events that really happened around removal was the removal of children, Native children, and placing them in federal Indian boarding schools. So these were schools that were sanctioned by the federal government, and they were run by Christian churches. And it wasn't just the Catholic Church. I know recently in the media, we've heard about the Pope and his address of this, but we also know that there's a lot of other Christian denominations that were involved in running some of these federal Indian boarding schools that had very adverse conditions, very traumatic and abusive conditions. So some of these children that were removed from their families and placed in these schools left as early as 3 years old and often didn't return, either because they died or because after leaving the school, they just didn't return to their tribal community. And if they did return, sometimes it wasn't until they were 17 or 18 years old. And at those schools, they really experienced harsh treatment. They were forced to do labor for local communities, hard labor. They didn't have enough food, so they were malnourished. They were separated, even if they went together with their siblings and cousins, they actually were separated from them. So they didn't actually grow up around their family, even when they were there, in some cases. And they, were abused, neglected, experienced sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, as they were told that their spiritual beliefs were weren't wrong and they couldn't practice them and they couldn't follow that way of belief. So there's just all this abuse that they experienced. So that's another example of removal. And then a third one that I'll mention, Lisa would probably be able to speak to this better than I would, but is really what happened with child welfare. So child welfare system played a huge part in removing children from tribal families. In the mid-1970s, Congress began an investigation of the state of child welfare agencies in removing children and found that 1/4 of all Indian children have been removed from their families by state welfare agencies and courts and placed in foster care. So if you can think about that, what if 1/4 of the children in your community were removed? How much of a detrimental effect this would have on your community, on your families. And so that is exactly what happened. And because of that, the Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted in 1978. And we still have that today, even though it is being brought before the Supreme Court right now to question whether or not it will continue to be law. But that law has been used to protect and to really prevent the disproportionate rate in which Native children are being removed from their families. And it's not because Native children are mistreating their children more than other populations. That's actually not the case when you look at the statistics. It's actually just that the removal of children is at a higher rate. Next slide. So we talked about the generational impacts, and we mentioned, the impact on genes that historical trauma can have, and that's known as epigenetics, and that's something that's starting to be researched a little bit more today. But this is just an example of how these historical events that were traumatic continue to have an impact on people today. So if we think about the boarding school experiences, there was a study done by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart in 2003, and she really looked at what happened to those survivors of those adverse boarding schools and what it was that they were facing when they came back to their communities. And what she found is that a lot of the experiences that they went through in those boarding schools was really very abusive. A lot of the ways that they were treated was very abusive and was very neglectful and toxic. And so taught to have toxic relationships. And so when they came home, that's the kind of cycle that began in a lot of families, was really that ineffective parenting and destructive parenting, that because they didn't receive good parenting, they came home and didn't know how to parent in a good way, in a way that they would have learned from their tribal community had they not been taken away. There was this trend of just having insensitivity to children's needs, really, being inconsistent or rejecting children, just having a lack of parental involvement, thinking poorly of schools and not having poor relations with school systems, having weak spiritual foundations and unhealthy family norms, and a weak ethnic identity that was then getting passed on to their children and their descendants. So that's one example of how historical trauma continues to have a legacy and impact in tribal communities today. Next slide. So that's the generational impact of racial trauma. I'm also going to mention the institutional impact of racial trauma. So that collective impact that we talked about earlier, really being caused as a result of institutional racism. So racial trauma, continues to be experienced today collectively as well as individually. And institutional racism is at the root of a lot of it. So institutional racism is any institutional activity that creates racial inequalities and results in the subordination and oppression of people of color. And so it doesn't matter if that activity is intentional. We've talked about how in the past in our history, for example, the Jim Crow laws, some of those segregation laws, they were intentional. But even today, some of that legacy continues, that even when it's not intentional, we kind of see it as business as usual. And so we continue to perpetuate some of the, some of the institutional racism that isn't very obvious to us, or isn't very, that we may not really be aware of, because we just kind of see it as business as usual. So institutional racism in the United States has created systems of power and privilege that are now pervasive throughout the country's institutions in government, education, criminal justice, as well as other types of institutions in our country. And like many other racial issues, we rarely talk about the meaning of power and privilege in our society, what it is, who has it, and its cost to equality in society. And power and privilege based on race creates the practice of racism in the United States. And many who hold or have access to power fail to realize they actually do have it. And power and privilege is like the air we breathe. It affects everyone, even if we can't really see it, or we fail to see it. And disproportionality encompasses both overrepresentation and disparity in outcomes of well-being for children of color. It's vital to obtain a clear understanding of how these children are facing within our service systems, because we may not be aware of the power and privilege and the institutional racism that is occurring in our systems. And so what we might see, though, is the disproportionality in our service systems. For example, a number of studies indicate that white children of color are not abused or neglected at a higher rate than Caucasian children in the child welfare system, but they are more likely to be in the child welfare system in greater numbers. And children of color also have more negative outcomes compared to Caucasian children within the child welfare system. So that's just one system as an example. And what we're seeing then is just kind of how this disproportionality, because we might all know, if there's disproportionality in education, if there's disproportionality in the criminal justice system, if there's disproportionality in child welfare system, how that can lead to some of the societal realities that we see today among tribal communities and among tribal people. For example, the fact that there's lower life expectancy the fact that there's greater involvement in the criminal justice system, the fact that there might be lower economic, socioeconomic status, or even high unemployment, that there might be low levels of educational attainment, maybe higher levels of dropout and lower levels of graduation rates. So these are just kind of showing the impact that institutional racism has and how it leads to some of the societal realities that we may see our young tribal youth facing today and what they might be up against. Next slide. Oh, before I go to the next slide, sorry. I do want to put into chat a handout. We only touched on this a little bit, power and privilege, but I do want to put a handout in chat, which is a privilege worksheet. So if you're curious, I know sometimes this may be difficult to think about, but I want to assure you that everybody has privilege, and there is a worksheet that you can take time in your personal time to do, and it'll really help you think about your own privilege, not just racial privilege, but also other type of privilege, like maybe even gender or economic privilege. So just kind of I invite you to do that worksheet and to see how privilege may be existent in your life and in your own experience. Next slide. So now we're at the point where we're talking about individual impacts of racial trauma in more depth. And so these are some terms around individual racism that I think are important for us to think about, because sometimes what can prevent us from really talking about racism, especially at an individual level, is really that term racist. So all of us are really trying to separate ourselves from that term and really, make it known to everyone that we're a safe person and that we don't harbor any kind of racist ideologies, or that we don't behave in that way. And so because of that, we often, like anytime we have these conversations, automatically we just want to say, well, I'm not racist, and that actually isn't helpful, because it kind of just shuts down any conversation that we can try to have around this. And especially in tribal communities who maybe there's people that face racism on a daily basis. If everyone says that they're not a racist, then how is it that tribal people are feeling like their reality is that they do experience racism? And so hopefully these terms will help us out a little bit more when we're having these conversations. So stereotype is that generalization of a particular group, that assumption that we make about groups of people. We generalize about them. And so there can be negative stereotypes as well as positive stereotypes. So stereotype isn't always a negative thing. It can be a positive generalization that we have of a particular group. And then prejudice is, it's that generalization, but there's also an emotional attachment to it. So there's an affect component to it. And that can also be positive or negative. So we can have a negative emotional attachment to a particular group, or we can have a positive emotional attachment to them. We can feel compassion towards that whole group, or we can feel disdain for that whole group. And then discrimination is really where we're acting on that prejudice. And so discrimination is where we're giving restrictive treatment based on our prejudice of a group and their characteristic. And it can have that emotional attachment to it. That's something to be aware of, is when you start to have prejudice, how your behavior is really acting that prejudice out, especially if you're providing services to Native youth. to tribal communities, we should really be aware of ourselves and our prejudices, and if there are any prejudices that we are acting out, and it's becoming a behavior, and maybe even a behavior pattern in how we provide services to that group. Next slide. So we're going to watch a video about microaggressions because I talk about just intentional, or I talk about, there's positive and negative stereotypes and positive and negative prejudices. But one way in which our prejudices or our stereotypes might actually become apparent to others, or that people of color might experience, is through microaggressions. And so microaggressions may not be, they're in the word itself, kind of lets us know that they're a little bit aggressive, but they're also micro. And so one of the things that gets misconstrued when we talk about microaggressions is because they're micro, that they're not really that big of a deal. So hopefully with this video, we can learn a bit more about the impact that microaggressions, what they are and how they can affect individuals.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem.
Oh, you're so well spoken.
Just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping.
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work.
So when are you gonna have a baby?
Watching TV.
We have to keep the Redskins' name. It's part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day.
Can I touch your hair?
Multiple times a day.
So pretty. Can I touch
it, please? Can I please?
Is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes. Which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
All right, so I apologize for the language, but I hope that video did get across the impact that microaggressions can have on individuals. Okay, good. At least I have one person that likes the video. Just kidding. So examples of microaggressions for Native people. So we'll just go ahead and look through these. And I'm curious. There's a lot of us on the webinar today, so I'm curious if you have heard of a microaggression, if you know of one, or if you heard it, or maybe even you've said one that you didn't realize was a microaggression. So I invite you to share and chat. But these are some examples as you guys are sharing. I'll just share some ones that pertain to Native people. So one, I've heard this before, I don't think of you as Native, I just think of you as a successful person, can be considered a microaggression. It must be hard for you to thrive in that community, can be considered a microaggression. And you don't sound, look, or seem Native, definitely a microaggression. and you always play the race card. Yes, that can be a hurtful comment. And I am so sick of hearing about Native Americans. You know, there are other minorities we could be talking about. Yes, that is also can be a hurtful comment. Okay, we have some folks that are sharing. Yes, someone mentioned that they experience microaggressions on the daily. And that others have been guilty of microaggressions. Someone's has heard, you know, you don't look or sound or seem Native all the time. Yes, it reminds me of that lady in the video at the beginning on cultural humility and how people just assumed that she wasn't African American. Yeah, you aren't like other Mexicans as another microaggression, absolutely. Okay. Oh, wow. You speak Spanish like a telenovela. So I chuckle at them, but as one person actually mentioned in chat, that they can actually, if you get them a lot, they can actually be pretty harmful and detrimental. Go to the next slide. You can continue to share your microaggressions, but I'll just talk about kind of the dangers of them. We kind of learned a little bit about that in the video, but I just want to emphasize one danger of microaggressions, and this is specifically as you're working with tribal youth, that we can actually gaslight people of color, Native people, out of our own unresolved racial and cultural anxiety. So that's where it comes back to our own identity development and how we can gaslight others by our microaggressions. So for example, a microaggression can be where we tell a young person, a tribal youth, that maybe there's another explanation, or maybe we tell our Native colleagues, maybe that really wasn't racism, that wasn't really discrimination, that there's another explanation, because you know that person, they would never do that, or they would never say that. So we might gaslight and just kind of convince our Native colleagues and those we serve that they're not actually experiencing what they're experiencing. And we might also try to get them to just adjust to their oppressive conditions. So when they're telling us about what they experience, these microaggressions, we might just tell them, it's better just to ignore it. It's better just to, just don't even let it affect you. And so we teach them to cope with it rather than to actually, maybe they would actually rather advocate for themselves, or they're really needing more allies around how to change those oppressive conditions so that they don't have to experience those microaggressions. So those are some of the dangers of microaggressions, particularly as we think about Native youth and as we're teaching them to deal with these microaggressions that they will likely experience in their life. Next slide. And I do want to make mention that sometimes, especially when we learn that we might unintentionally cause harm, that microaggressions can be unintentional. And so we might unintentionally cause harm. And so sometimes just knowing that we can be part of the problem, it causes us to just want to go back to this concept of color blindness. And so we want to go back to, one of the messages of like, everybody's human, race is just a construct, and, I don't see color, or I don't see you as Native, or I don't see you as different. And so when we say those things, we're trying to go back to this idea of color blindness. And to this picture on the left of these fishes that are all the same color. But in reality is actually on the right, especially for people of color who are darker skinned, who have darker hair or different textured hair than maybe the dominant what's norm in that community or norm in society. And so I think that's why we can actually cause more harm, because tribal youth do see those differences, and it may be because they see those differences because they experience racism, they experience being treated differently, being treated based on the color of their skin or based on their just them being a tribal member. This is why, we often hear, like in tribal communities, how there's even a history of people who hid their tribal membership because they did want to really blend in, because they knew that society was going to treat them differently, that they were going to have these experiences in life because of their tribal identity. And so tribal youth don't have a choice but to see the differences. And so that's why we want to come back to really valuing differences and not really just trying to be colorblind to them or to ignore them. And so that's one thing I wanted to share before we go into next slide. So this wraps up our conversation around how we see others. And I just want to give you guys an opportunity again in chat. As we have been doing, we have some questions on the screen around the cost of racism. So we've talked about racial trauma and some of the impacts it has, the cost that it may have to individuals who experience it. And so what are some of the costs of racism that you've experienced, that you think tribal communities and tribal youth, tribal people experience? And are there things in your life that you could do to decrease the cost of racism for tribal people? Maybe things that you could do in your professional role that could actually help to decrease the cost of racism. So please feel free to share in chat. Yeah, we have some folks asking for a copy of the PowerPoint. We will send that out after the webinar today. So thank you for asking, mentioning that. So someone mentioned the cost of racism for them was losing friends. Or connection opportunities. Someone mentioned maybe a way that they can decrease the cost of racism is to set limits for their youth hangout. Someone mentioned the cost of racism for them is self-doubt in academic and professional settings. Absolutely. That imposter syndrome, it's hard to get away from. Students feel shut out, oftentimes physically won't lift their heads or speak because they don't feel their voice matters. Yep. A way to decrease the cost of racism, Heather mentions, be open, responsive, and respectful. Yes. And a cost of racism is many tribal youth have school early and believe university will be the same. Yeah. so much of our schooling structures are based on settler values, absolutely. Personal costs of racism, lost identity and culture, which often leads to mental health issues, absolutely. A lot of our tribal peoples may face that, just that history of forced assimilation policies that really kind of reduced that sense of cultural identity. And so that is something that's common among tribal peoples. And we're trying to reverse that in our tribal communities by connecting our tribal youth to more cultural learning and opportunities. Thank you guys so much for sharing that. Feel free if you think of some more things to share that in chat. I'm going to go ahead and move us to the next section. The last leg of our webinar today. And I'm actually going to share some cultural humility practices. So you guys have already started to share some of those and just in chat when you're talking about how to reduce the cost of racism for tribal people and the tribal youth you work with. So I'll just share some strategies and practices that might be helpful as we finish up today. The first one that I'll mention is developing Indigenous literacy. And I'm actually going to put a handout. We're going to put a handout in chat that comes from the National Museum of American Indians. And it's essential understandings of American Indians. And so in my state, in Montana, there's actually something that really happened years ago where the tribes came together and they had some representatives and they developed what was called the 7 Essential Understandings of Montana Indians. And it was really an effort by tribal peoples in the state to make it known to others what it was that they felt like were some essential learnings, areas that really folks across Montana could be more aware of and could understand about tribal peoples in the state. And so they developed these 7 essential understandings. And the National Museum of American Indians has also done something similar. I don't know a lot about the process that they followed, but they do have similar essential understandings. You can learn more about it on their website, but this is a handout of their framework around that. So I share that around this topic because some of us may be very new to working with tribal communities, and so we may have very limited knowledge, and that's not uncommon. That is actually pretty common because we don't learn about tribal peoples in school. If you don't live with or near by tribal peoples, you may not even see a tribal person your whole life. And so, of course, that actually sets us up for being illiterate when it comes to tribal people. And although we learned in the video that you can't learn everything about a people just by taking a course or just by reading some literature, that's a good start. And so these are just some suggestions around developing your own literacy to devote time and resources to do this, especially if you're working directly with tribal people. I would say that this is an essential part of your professional duty in order to work with those tribal communities. And then to learn about the tribal community's history. I mentioned some of that today, but each tribe is unique. There's over 500 federally recognized tribe and like much more and more that are state recognized, and then some that are not recognized by the government. And they all have unique histories and cultures. They all have unique languages and experiences. And so being able to learn about the people that you are serving. And it might be that your tribal youth that you serve come from different backgrounds, tribal backgrounds. So it may take some time for you to actually learn about all the different tribes that they represent. But just knowing that tribal peoples are sovereign nations and that these children belong to them. That is where who they belong to, and and so being able to know who they are would actually help you to know better how to serve the youth that you have. And then identify whether a community has more than one tribe. We talked about that, and then rely on primary sources of information. So that's why I shared that National Museum of American Indian source, but there's other sources such as tribal websites. You could have universities that have some resources. Tribal colleges are a good source of learning as well. Maybe there's some suggestions that you guys have. Please go ahead and share that in the chat if you can think of any primary sources of information that might be helpful to folks to learn more about the tribes that they serve. Next slide. And then another strategy is to build authentic relationships. And so really emphasizing the authenticity piece, because as you are working with tribal communities, it's really important for you to be aware of your own identity, and then to come authentically in relationship with tribal peoples with that identity, wherever it is, whatever it is that you're at with it, however you would identify yourself as, and just being authentically yourself, bringing your whole self. And that can be something that is kind of not the norm, especially in professional settings. We might actually be used to like just checking our personal selves at the door in our professional settings. And that can be a societal norm, the dominant culture's norm of doing that. But it's really, much more personable when we work with tribal communities. And, tribes really do value relationships. Because of that history that we have of historical trauma, there might be some mistrust. We call it historical mistrust. And so it may take some time to actually build relationships with tribal peoples, especially if you are non-tribal or not from their community. And so, relationships are so important to really establishing good working relations with individuals with tribal backgrounds. And just making sure that the relationships that you have are sustainable and mutually beneficial and reciprocal. Those are just some values that are really important to many tribal communities. And so making sure that it's not transactionary, it's not just, your relationship is not just rooted in literature or on paper, but is, and that it's not, something that runs out, that ends because the grant ends, but really kind of looking at building sustainable reciprocal relationships. Next slide. Another handout that I'll put in chat, because Lisa did talk about the stages of identity development. And so you may be curious about maybe the tribal youth that you're working with are moving through some of these stages. And so these are just some building blocks. We call them building blocks that might actually help your young people who may be trying to work through their own identity development. And so if you're in a position to support them in that way, we have a handout that gives some suggestions based on age or based on where an individual is at with the stages of identity development that might actually help you in just kind of thinking about how do you introduce the topic of identity or racial and ethnic identity to tribal youth. So we'll go ahead and check that document out. And it's really with the intention that we want to support tribal youth so that as they're dealing with exploring, as they're kind of developing pride around who they are, as they're learning to interact with other cultures, and as we know that they may be facing some racism or discrimination, that there's ways that we can support them to be, to ensure that they are mentally, psychologically, and socially taken care of through this process. And so hopefully that resource will be helpful to you. Next slide. And these are just some suggestions around, as we're thinking about supporting young people with their identity. It might be helpful to kind of bring up the issue of race and ethnicity as important and valuable. Maybe letting them know that it's important to you, and that if it's something that is on their minds or important to them, being open to discuss it, letting them know that you're willing to listen, and then just being prepared. You might be asked questions about your own identity, and we talked about that earlier, that where you're at with your own identity can have an impact on how the messages you send. So really being aware of the messages you're sending to tribal youth, and just being prepared that they may ask you questions about your own identity, and thinking through some of those responses ahead of time might be helpful. And then just being open to the possibility that they actually might not want to talk about it. So they might not want to hear you, listening, talking about racial and ethnic identity. It might not be something that they're ready for, or that they feel like it affects them yet in their life, or that they're aware of. And so that might also be just meeting them where they're at. And then just making sure that if you do have conversations around racial and ethnic identity and your youth are ready for that, that it's not a single one-time thing, that it's actually something that becomes an ongoing practice, and that you are willing to bring up that topic on a regular basis, and especially when our young people are trying to work through some of the experiences that they may be having. And next slide. And so we also mentioned that there might be some young people that are struggling with the impacts of historical trauma. They're struggling with the impacts of racial trauma. And so what might be helpful is really not diagnosing that. Instead, we're going to try to depathologize how we support young people with historical trauma, and really help to support our young ones with shifting the narrative that may often be spoken about tribal peoples in a very, it's a lot of times the trauma history of tribal peoples that is talked about. So we talked about that today, but really trying to shift that narrative to more of the strengths of tribal communities and tribal people, and especially the strengths that have been passed down. And remembering that, we're not going to change things quickly or overnight, or it actually may be difficult to try to make this shift or to try to heal from historical trauma. But we're really kind of being aware of the fact that we are a part of ongoing efforts to really bring healing to future generations. And so what you do today, recognizing and realizing that it does impact future generations, even if you don't see or feel the impact of how you support healing from historical trauma, you know, immediately, that we're actually, it's a long game, a long-term game. And next slide. So some of the ways that we might try to heal, support healing, is really being mindful of how we view tribal peoples and their societal realities, how we view the behaviors of tribal people, and the especially the tribal youth that you serve directly, and how you view certain societal realities that may be occurring in the community, such as illnesses or addictions, or other types of things like that. And really using your historical trauma lens, recognizing that a lot of the struggles, societal realities are really caused by historical trauma and caused by white supremacy culture and caused by institutional racism, as we talked about. And so, you know, the judgment that we might have towards youth or just tribal people, you know, like you're not, we may make judgments about, you know, you're not a good parent, you know, you're not behaving well, you're not a good kid, and really trying to shift some of that perspective and really taking into consideration historical trauma's impact on those, on individual people as well as entire communities. And so really keeping that in mind when we have our assumptions and opinions about those that we're serving. Next slide. And then just want to wrap up here because we're coming to the end of time, but I do want to mention that as we're shifting to more strength-based perspectives, part of that is really looking for ways to where we can actually help to support resilience, and resiliency being really those assets within our community and within individuals and families that really help to buffer them against the effects of trauma. So that being what's going to help them buffer them against the effects of racial trauma, against historical trauma, institutional racism, and individual racism. What are those things that are really going to help to build them up? Is it those proactive messages, those protective messages? What are those ways that are really going to help them deal with some of these challenges that they're facing? Next slide. So I will mention some protective factors that are culturally based, because we often think about protective factors in a broader society as being, you know, things like building mastery and relationships, but there are also some more culturally specific ways that we can actually help to buffer, help our young people learn, to support them as they're healing from trauma, and to actually be factors that help them develop factors that really buffer them against the effects of trauma. So maybe there's some cultural skills that your young people can learn that they never had a chance to learn before. Maybe it's something that a skill that they don't have access to within their own family because of that history of assimilation. So the power of reintroducing some of these cultural skills, helping them to connect to maybe learning more about their own cultural talents that maybe they didn't know they had, but through your involvement in their life, they're having access to that. It could be reinstituting, reinforcing some of the cultural values and beliefs within your program, within your organization, that may be different from the dominant beliefs, but actually explicitly teaching those to young people, and also modeling it as well for them, and just helping them with their sense of cultural identity and connection to their cultural community. I know sometimes, especially in urban areas, connecting to cultural community can be a challenge, but even if it's not their own tribal culture, I do know the impact that it can have when tribal youth in urban settings can connect to any type of tribal culture that often reminds them of home, or often just knowing that they have another Native person that they can relate to, or they can build relationships with, can be helpful. So with that, I will pass it over to Lisa, and she's going to go ahead and close us out as we are running out of time. But thank you guys so much for joining us today, and please be looking out. Please fill out the evaluation and be looking out for the handouts and the slides. But thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thank you all. It's been our absolute pleasure spending this time with you today. And again, we would like to thank TYRC for making this happen. We would just like to leave you with the beautiful words from Elsie Boudreau. We must acknowledge that we are all related. When one child is hurt, we all hurt. And the opposite is true as well. When one child is protected and loved, put in a place of honor, we all benefit. Next slide. And this is how you are able to reach out to us too. I know we ran out of time, but if you have any other resources or questions or anything you would like to share with us, this is how you could reach out to us. Antonia or Laura, is there anything else you would like to add?
Nope, just thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful event. Really appreciate both of you for sharing your time and energy and wisdom with us, and just appreciation to everyone who's taken time out of their day to be with us for this learning event.
Bye all. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.